the room became very distorted, and I thought my bones were all melting. And I just wanted to scream that I wanted to get out of there. And I saw the squirrels outside, and I thought, they're not the squirrels, I'm the squirrel. I'm in this cage, and I can't get out. And I started to throw myself from side to side in the room.
My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH. I am your host, Richard Dix. This is episode number 80 here. We're going to talk about the CIA and a bunch of government-funded human-based experiments. But before we get to there, of course, this is the beginning part where I kind of ramble on for a little bit. We got a little bit of housekeeping to get through. What am I watching? And I'll mention it later on in the show a little bit, but I just started watching the show called Wormwood. It's on Netflix, and it's a show about the suicide/murder of an army scientist in the 50s. His name is Dr. Frank Olson. He was drugged by the CIA with LSD. He also worked for the CIA kind of on a company retreat. 2 days later, he quote-unquote fell out a window in New York City. And so it's a show. It's about that entire time, which has everything to do with what we're doing right now, which is why I was watching it. And his son plays a large part in the show itself, and they kind of bounce back from documentary to I guess fictionalized version. What do they call those? I guess something like that. Yeah, really good. So if you listen to this and you just can't get enough, and you're just like, oh, I mean, because I kind of caught the bug. I mean, when you find out just how much all the stuff that the CIA really did to Americans, it probably still does to Americans, if we're being honest. It is wild. So yeah, that's what I'm watching. What am I listening to? I was literally listening to this podcast in my car the other day, and in the last episode, I mentioned that I say, "Hey Siri, play Up First," because I mentioned that I'm listening to Up First, and literally when I was listening to it, my car stopped and Siri played Up First. I thought it was so funny. It was pointless to mention here, but I chuckled. It was a good time. So yeah, last week it was Up First. This week, honestly, I mean, I don't like to say this because people judge you when you say this. I'm back on my Rogan kick. I'm back listening to Rogan pretty hard right now. I've always been a fan, but I'm not always up on the latest episodes. And I really can't even say I'm on the most recent episodes now. I've kind of done deep dives is what I've been doing recently, is going back to the older episodes. But yeah, that's what I'm listening to. Like I always say, if I can plug any of that stuff, I can talk about my mini episode, our mini episode, the bite-sized bios. Every other Monday at 4:30 a.m. we cover somebody from history and give you the elevator pitch of why they're important to history. Episodes are usually no longer than about 20 to 25 minutes long. Our last, most recent episode was about Eleanor Roosevelt, and if you guys listened to that, it was awesome. I mean, I'm just saying, not really how I did, but I'm saying she herself was awesome. The speeches that we kind of pulled from, and I hope you guys checked out the We're Excited, because like the long form, she was somebody, I was actually listening to that today. Here's some of her speeches. She was just very eloquent. She had a very good command of the English language. She knew what she was doing when she was talking, which not everybody. It's refreshing to see that. I mean, even though it's a 70-year-old video, but I mean, still. But yeah, so that was our last BSB. We covered a lot of people, and we're still covering now in the same vein of all these 40s to 70s characters. So we're gonna keep with that until we get out of the series, and then we'll go back to kind of just doing different people from other parts of history. But as always, you can find all the extras at hdthappen.com. All the socials are at hdthappen. Like I said, there will be some good stuff to check out on the Works Cited, I think, for these last couple episodes, especially because I've been kind of looking at some other places for information, kind of diving into some conversations to find information, which is different than just reading articles and different stuff like that. So I would recommend going and checking it out, because it's a little bit more extensive than I feel like it has been in the past. But yeah, so I don't think there's much else to say before we get on to the episode here. But yeah, without further ado, as we know what to do, here is the episode.
I think they murdered him. They had a drug to test, and that's all they cared about. They didn't care whether he lived or died.
All right, so we're going to be talking about basically all of the different type of human experiments that were conducted by the government between the times of like 1945 to like 1970, which works well with our series that we're doing right now. It initially started, if you've been following the pod for a little while, it started with our last actual HDTH, which was about the JFK assassination, and it led into this whole idea of, and probably the truth, not even an idea, that the CIA had a heavy-handed involvement in the assassination of JFK, and that they did this through, well, we didn't really figure out how they did it. We figured out how they were trying to cover it up, and to me, that's what was the most evidence we found on the last episode was about how they tried to cover it up. But that led us into thinking about all the different ways that the CIA has dealt with this mind control. Reason being because that's how they kind of got Jack Ruby to shut up. If you can follow me a little bit, Jack Ruby was the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the man who killed JFK. And so once they had Jack Ruby in custody, one of the main scientists from MK Ultra, which we're going to get into a little bit later, he comes in and quote unquote talks to Jack Ruby, and then after that, the man just falls into a fit of delirium. He just goes crazy, and no one really puts two and two together. No one thinks anything about it. I mean, they think it's kind of weird, but if they knew all the stuff that I'm about to tell you, they wouldn't even think it's weird. They would just understand. So we're going to start with this because there's a lot of information to kind of get through here. We're going to start with a brief history of the CIA, because I feel like the CIA is the overarching umbrella for pretty much all of the human experiments that were done by the government. They were the ones who were looking for answers, if you will. So they're the ones who they were putting the money up to try to get the answers. So it's important to talk about them before we even get to the weird stuff. And boy, will it get weird. So, brief history of the CIA. Before World War II, the State Department, the FBI, and the U.S. Armed Services were collecting intelligence with no direct coordination. They really didn't know how to work together. They were all doing their own thing, but nobody was working in conjunction with one another. Frustrated by this piecemeal, stovepiped information that he was receiving, old FDR created the Office of Coordinator of Information. Now, this is considered to be the first, if you will, predecessor of the CIA. The first idea, as we said, that the Central Intelligence Agency, just in the name, it is the center, right, of all of your intelligence. That's what they were trying to get. So the first time that we do that is right before World War II, when we get the Office of Coordinator of Information. Now, this office was led by World War I hero General William Wild Bill Donovan. All right, and his main goal was to gather foreign intelligence related to the upcoming war, or the war that was happening. As I said before World War II, it was really before our entrance into World War II. The entire time that World War II is happening, we're just watching, kind of knowing at some point that we're going to have to get into it. I mean, almost similar to, let's not get too far in the future, our war in Ukraine, but that's for a whole nother day. So as World War II progressed, Donovan, Wild Bill, and FDR, they reevaluated the COI's size, organization, and mission. Because basically, once they create this office, they realize the need for it, almost immediately. Because it works. It makes sense. As we said before, it was the FBI and the armed services, and they everybody was doing their own thing. The State Department, they weren't coming together. So at Donovan's suggestion, FDR transformed the COI into a brand new office with a title that reflected the importance of strategy and intelligence gathering and clandestine operations. There is born the Office of Strategic Service. So that happens in 1941. The OSS becomes the first centralized intelligence agency in American history.
The Office of Strategic Services. Their motto was Surprise, Kill, Vanish, because they would jump out of aircraft, land, work with their French partners, and kill Nazis.
And you know who runs that? You know who heads up the first OSS? You better believe it's Wild Bill. And that's what I'm going to call him. I don't know if we're going to talk about him too much more, but every time he comes up, if you get a nickname like that, we don't use your first name. I don't even know what it was. William. Yeah. No, we don't use you when you're Wild Bill. So he would lead the OSS, he'd be the first one. And they would kind of focus on analyzing strategic information and conducting unconventional and paramilitary operations. Now that's where it gets gray. Though initially some of the other U.S. agencies were not loving the idea of the OSS, they kind of would eventually get over it. And the OSS would continue to grow in its worldwide scope of intelligence capabilities through military, diplomatic, and non-official cover. At its peak, The OSS employed over 13,000 military personnel and civilians, 35% of whom were women. Now, it's interesting to point out, and I don't think we'll actually even get to this, but it's been mentioned in different documentaries and podcasts that I've listened to that women can serve a specific service and role in the idea of actually spying. And it may, and I know in your mind first might be jumping to some sort of, I don't know, some sort of sexual activity or something like that. And it's not that, but it's adjacent, I guess, if you will. There have been times, I guess, they've said where, spies are doing spy things. And there's just certain places where, a woman can slip in and go unnoticed in a place where in a capacity where a man would just immediately be, noticed. I think they mentioned an idea or an example of someone being in a park on a park bench or something like that. And the woman is just, I think she embraces the man beside her and just starts kissing him, I guess. And something, where you couldn't do that with two men. I mean, you could theoretically. I mean, we live in a world where that's true. But I think we're talking about the past, and then through, in the last 50 to 60 years, it was something that would have been very, people would have been like, what is going on here? But so yeah, the woman could do things that a man just couldn't do. So I think that's why also we see there's such a large percentage of women that work for the CIA almost immediately. So the OSS, it only existed for about 3 years because it really only existed kind of into World War II and then right out of World War II. So in 1945, at the end of World War II, President Harry S. Truman abolished the OSS with many other wartime agencies. And this left the nation without a non-departmental, strategically oriented intelligence service. And so after he did that, he merged the OSS with the SSU. They just love putting letters together. The SSU is the Strategic Services Unit. And the SSU took a temporary role filling former OSS posts across the globe until the U.S. could put a more permanent solution in place. It is important to mention, I want to give you guys full disclosure here. What I'm reading is a synopsis taken from the CIA's website itself as far as to give you their history. We're definitely not going to keep drinking their Kool-Aid as we go on and talk about the things that have happened, but I think it's, because when you talk about the beginning, I don't think it's that important, or I don't think many people are probably lying about how that started, in my opinion. But definitely just wanted to say that, because if you ever search in their website and you're like, oh, this sounds really familiar to what I heard on this podcast. Yeah, it's the same thing. I'm kind of paraphrasing here and there, but this is the first few years of what would become the CIA. And I think it's important, like you always know we do on this podcast. I give you the beginning. I give you the foundation before we even start to build things on it. I can't start coming in here and talking about mind control and all this crazy stuff and BZ and all that before I even tell you what the OSS or the SSU or any of those good letters even mean.
We come from all branches of OSS, arriving at a special area to begin our basic military training. Some of us entered the service while in OSS and continued in the same jobs without military training. Others transferred from various branches of the Army before completing their training. Now all of us will undergo the equivalent of the first 6 weeks of the Army basic course. Fresh from offices and laboratories, we leave our real names behind for reasons of security and are given student names which we will be known by for the duration of our training. Names such as Joe, Ben, and Al. Mine was Michael. At the same time, stripes, too, are forgotten, since all students are treated as book privates for the time being.
Administrative officials decided to move the SSU's duties and responsibilities to the newly created Central Intelligence Group. So we're coming back to the idea of having our intelligence gathered in a centralized manner and area. The CIG, as it would be called, was granted the authority to conduct independent research and analysis. This meant they could move simply beyond coordinating the intelligence to produce intelligence. They could do whatever they want, really. And I think it's important, something that I learned, and I'll drop this little gem to you before we get even deeper. We talk about the CIA. The CIA itself operates under the executive branch of government. I never knew that. That is news to me. I don't know why. I mean, some of you might think, okay, you might know that, but when I read that, it made so much sense as to why they're able to do what they do, because they're not even law enforcement. You know what I mean? If you think about all the rest of the old alphabet boys, I'm pretty sure they all operate under, the DOJ, right? At the very least, it's not probably the DOD, but definitely the DOJ, right? We're talking ATF, DEA, FBI, all that good stuff. The CIA, these guys are basically an arm of the president, which is why they're able to do some real nefarious kind of, morally questionable, things. So, but this is where we kind of I think really they say, what they say, yeah, the OSS and all that stuff. I mean, the OSS, and we'll get into that. I mean, maybe a little bit, and there's just so much here. There's just so much here, so I can't even lie. We may not even get to all of it, but that's why we have our Trusty Dusty mini episode coming up next week. We're going to get back into it. Please, you believe. So this is the first time I think that the CIG gets the cachet that I feel like the CIA would come to enjoy. Meaning, like, this is the first time that we're out of war and we have an agency like the CIA. They start to see the need. They saw the need in wartime, and truthfully, as we know, once we get out of World War II, we just slide right into the Cold War, which is technically just another type of war. So we're never really not at war, but they start to see its importance. So the first person they get to choose to lead the CIG is Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, Soures, pronounce it how you wish, folks. I'm sure he has a way that he likes to hear it pronounced. He was the Deputy Chief of Naval Intelligence at the end of World War II. So he was the first person to be the quote-unquote director of Central Intelligence. And this will go on to be an important position because, truthfully, if you look at the way our intelligence community is structured now, which we won't get too deep into where it's at now, truthfully, in the podcast, because it's really just more how did it happen, all the stuff that the CIA did with their government-funded human-based experiments and all that stuff. But the CIA is the leader of the intelligence community even now. And so the director of the Central Intelligence is, I think, the way, if I understand it correctly, is like the leader of all of the agencies. Like, they all report to them. They have their own bosses, but they all kind of report to him. And he's the one who kind of goes to the president and is like, hey, this is what we think, Mr. Prez. So, yeah, in 1946, the CIG happens. In 1947, because he had realized how awesome the CIG was doing, he was like, you know what? I'm going to give you guys a new name, and we're going to make you a new agency. There you go. That's your present. Just keep doing good. I'm going to change it again. So the National Security Act of 1947 established the CIA as an independent civilian intelligence agency within the executive branch. The act charged the CIA with coordinating the nation's intelligence, like I was saying before, among other duties, collecting, evaluating, and disseminating intelligence affecting national security. Also would then go on to create the Director of Central Intelligence, which is like what I was saying earlier, and it would make him the person who would lead both the CIA and the entire intelligence community as a whole. Like I said, I never really understood, and I mean, maybe you do, I don't know. I never really understood how all that, like the hierarchy of it. I never really thought about who's running who in that situation. I mean, so basically, if you're the leader of the CIA, you are like the big dog when it comes to spies. You're like the spy of all spies. You're like James Bond times 10. So that's probably, I mean, as much as I want to do for the timeline, is a little bit more. I mean, so now we're almost firmly in the 50s. It would continue. America would continue to realize how important the CIA was to its prosperity, to its growing. I mean, because it's different than just having the FBI. It's different than just, because I've always seen the FBI as just like, cops on steroids. They're smart cops. They're good guys. You know what I mean? But they're cops. They do some stuff, but they're not spies, right? They're not doing the stuff that basically we can't even always talk about as a country, as a government. They're, they realized how much they needed the CIA to do stuff like that. So we find ourselves, let's see, we're going to put ourselves in the 50s because that's kind of where the CIA starts to do, not start, because I don't know. They do, it's pretty much fishy from the beginning, but the 50s is when they kind of start to do more fishy stuff. So what we find here in our research about the CIA and all the different projects and missions they went on, is that there was, of course, a lot of this is rooted in the Cold War, right? A lot of this has to do with our adversaries, Joseph Stalin and so forth, going forward, our good friend Nikita Khrushchev, right? So, but just the Russians, the USSR as a whole, and always wondering, what are these guys doing? How can we be better than them, right? And so basically after, when we hit the 50s, the idea becomes that the other side is developing mind control techniques. That really comes from, you can say, I think you want to get the timeline just right, but really from what I've understood and read, there had been Korean War POWs who were pilots who had been taken, by the Koreans, North Korea, specifically, and they had been put on, I think, state-run televisions talking about some of the bad things that the Americans had done. I think they dropped some specific, like, nerve agents or gas on the Korean people. And when it got back to the Americans, and when the Americans found out, they were like, that's not true. The only way this is possible is if they had been somehow brainwashed. So these guys must have, it's a leap to say the least, but like they must have been brainwashed. So if these guys are brainwashing people, we've got to figure out how they're doing it so that we can also do the same thing. That seems to be, I think, for both sides, the way that they just operate for like 50 years. Oh, you're doing it? Well, I'm doing it too. I'm doing it better. No, I'm doing it better. It's just like the Cold War in a nutshell. So like around this time in the early 50s, they think that the Russians / the Koreans are brainwashing all of the people that they're capturing over there. So they start to think, how can we do it? And that is really the impetus, and what will go on to be just a really messed up next 20 years for the CIA. Even they look at it and be like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. We probably might, I don't know. But really what I think, I thought about this earlier today. I think that it worked out. I don't want to get too deep into conspiracy here, but I think because you wouldn't tell people if that actually worked out. It sounds much better to be like, and then we didn't find anything, and then we shredded all the records. It was so bad, yada yada yada. No, it's like that's what you tell people if you actually figured it out. You don't want people to know that you know how to brainwash people. But so what I find here, and where we start for the actual documents that have to do with this, is Project Bluebird, right? And so what I've got here is the actual. I'm going to be quoting from a specific CIA document from April 5th, 1950, and it is about the idea of trying to. Well, I'll just read it to you. The purpose of this project is to provide for the immediate establishment of interrogation teams for the operational support of OSO and OPC activities. The team will utilize the polygraph, drugs, and hypnotism to attain the greatest results in interrogation techniques. It is important that this project be established, inasmuch a considerable public and government interest has recently developed in the use of hypnotism for interrogation and for personality control purposes. So these guys are really, really trying to change somebody's mind. They're trying to shift somebody's brain chemistry to have them think and do whatever they want them to do. But I'm saying this is April 5th, 1950. This is what I would consider to be the beginning of the CIA's ideas to mind control. Project Bluebird would get rolled into Project Artichoke, I believe the next year. And so Project Artichoke's main focus was to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an act of attempted assassination. The project also studied the effects of hypnosis, forced addiction to morphine and other chemicals. They really got into LSD. They wanted to produce amnesia and other vulnerable states in their subjects. And Project Artichoke is important because Project Artichoke was then succeeded by MK Ultra, Project MK Ultra, which began in 1953, and of course is the one that I think a lot of people know about, and it gets a lot more attention than some of the ones I'm going to mention here later on. But what we'll find, like I said earlier, with the CIA being the entire umbrella, is that the MK Ultra studies were really the ones who were also doing some of these smaller studies throughout the country and the world. It was lesser known, but they were all basically kind of, I don't know if you will, supervised or at least advised upon by CIA agents. And like I said, they'd be doing this. They did this in America, and we're definitely going to cover that. But they also did it outside of America as well, and that was, I think, gets lost in the idea of like the MK Ultra stuff. Like we're going to talk about the stuff they did in like San Francisco and all that, but they did stuff all over the world. They did stuff in Germany. They did stuff in Asia. They did stuff in South America. I mean, they didn't just leave it to just Americans. I think the part that gets people so riled up about this entire thing is the fact that they did it to Americans too. But we have to just be fully, transparent here and say they did it to a bunch of other countries as well. And it was kind of where because we talk about the drugs, and we're going to talk a lot about the different nerve agents they also did, but they also experimented around this exact same time with torture. And this is where they really kicked off a lot of their ideas about torture. And it also must be mentioned, of course, with the Operation Paperclip stuff. Like they brought over Nazi scientists and Nazi war criminals basically, and they had all these different ideas about how to really mess some people up. And they didn't just get it from them, but this is really where we find where they start to integrate kind of both of them at the same time, or start to study them around the same time. And some of them occur on some of the same bases, one of which being Fort Amador. I think you can pronounce it Amador. It's around the Panama Canal in the Pacific, and it was what will become to be the beginning of what's called the School of the Americas. And that's important. It's a little bit of a tangent here from what we've specifically been talking about, but it's really more has to do with, this is where I think some of the initial ideas were developed, were at this school, were for some of the torture, because they have manuals from the school that talk about the different ways to use fear, payment of bounties for enemy dead, beatings, false imprisonment, executions of use of the truth serum, different things like that. They were really about ways, I guess you could say, subversive tactics to get your enemy to talk in a way. And this is where that started. And it's important because it still exists now, and it's actually in Georgia. It moved to like the state of Georgia, the same place that we get Migos. We also have the School of the Americas. It changed its name as well. It goes by the Western Hemisphere Institute for Cooperation, which is WINSEC. If you've ever heard of that, that's what they're talking about. And it's also important because they've schooled some of the worst South American and Central American dictators that kind of ever existed in the 20th century. They, people like Manuel Noriega and some others that I could list here, but I actually don't have the list to even tell you. But I think it's something like 11 different ones, like documented, were trained and got their ideas from this school. So that was kind of just something to mention. That was one of the first places that the CIA started to do some of their. They tried LSD out there on some people. They also tried some torture techniques out there on some people. But before we get to any of the actual operations, I thought it'd be important to discuss at least two of the main players that kind of oversaw or had a lot to do with MK Ultra, because you want to put a face to a name, right? We all want to know who was doing what, where. So the first guy we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about two people, and then we're going to briefly cover LSD, because I mean, we're speaking as if everyone just knows what it is and understands it in all capacities. May not be the case. So we're going to start with the first guy. His name is Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb, pretty solid name. He was born to Hungarian Jewish immigrant parents, Fanny and Louis, in the Bronx, BX all day, on August the 3rd, 1918. His older brother was a plant biologist. His name was David Gottlieb. Sidney always had a bit of a stutter. He earned a master's degree in speech therapy from San Jose State University after retiring from the CIA, so I guess he conquered that at some point. But he was born with a club foot, so old Sidney's got a bunch of problems. Let's just run this back for a second. Sidney Gottlieb stutters, and he has a club foot. He's definitely not the most popular kid on the block. That actually got him rejected from military service in World War II. I'm just reading the notes. This is wild, but did not prevent his lifelong pursuit of folk dancing as a passion. Good for you, Sidney. Don't let anybody hold you down. No one can hold you back, Sidney. He graduated from James Monroe High School in 1936 and enrolled in City College in NYC. Now I'm reading you all this because this is the guy. This is the man who would oversee MK Ultra. So I'm not just reading you some random guy's bio. It's important, I think, to learn about these men as we talk about all the horrific things they did. So once he got into the college at NYC, he decided to transfer to a school that offered a legitimate agricultural biology course. He wanted to go to the University of Wisconsin, but he actually ended up going to Arkansas Tech. What a compromise, where he studied botany, organic chemistry, and the principles of dairying. Dairying. Is that what it's called? When you own a dairy farm, are you just dairying? I never thought of it as a verb. Dairying. So he's a dairier. No, that's dairying. I got to Google that. Hold on. Dairying. We're going to find out what that means, because I just read it like at the thing, and I imagine a lot of people probably don't know. Whoa. I'm Googling it, and Google already is talking like it's a word too. Dairying. Oh, it's just another way of saying dairy farming. Okay. All right, people. Sometimes we can just say things when we mean things. So yeah, he did that. Old Gottlieb was great at ATU. Because he was so good at ATU, it won him a mission at the University of Wisconsin. So he eventually got to go where he wanted to go. He graduated magna cum laude in 1940. He met his wife, Margaret. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian missionary. They got married. Let's see, they lived in a remote cabin near Vienna, Virginia. I've heard about this guy here with no electricity and no running water. This guy was like the Unabomber, but with a family. And he lived like that for a long time. That was just the way he worked. So his first day of work for the CIA was in 1951, July 13th, 1951. And MK Ultra would start 2 years later in 1953. So he's the first one. He's like, he would go on to basically, I think he oversaw, let me see if I got the years right. I think most of it. Let's see, Sidney Gottlieb, we got here. Died in 1999. Just for anybody's wondering. When I look these people up, I'm always wondering when they died, how they died. Yeah, he basically oversaw it the entire time. He retired from the CIA in 1973, which is right around the time when they chose to destroy the documents, which I think we'll get to that. But so yeah, he ran it the entire time. How did he die? So we're going to talk about it. heart problems. Okay, not that interesting. All right, so yeah, that was Sidney Gottlieb. Now we're going to get to Dr. Jolyn West. Now he's the guy who kind of, I think, in my opinion, sparked the whole idea to go into the MK Ultra. Who is this guy? What are they doing? He also died in 1999. That's a little odd. And I mentioned before in the other episode he had a first name. He does. His name is Louis. Louis Jolyn West or Jolyon. I don't know. I got Jolyn and I got Jolyn. Neither one actually sound like names. We'll go with Louis J. West. All right, so Dr. Jolyn West, he was born in Brooklyn, New York on October the 6th, 1924 to Ukrainian Jewish immigrant parents who taught him to play the piano. They don't have his mother and father's name. They do say he grew up in poverty in Madison, Wisconsin. He also went to the University of Wisconsin, but only for a year. And then he went to the University of Iowa. While there, he enrolled in the Army Specialized Training Program during World War II, earning his MD from the University of Minnesota's Medical School in 1949. So these are all the guys. Like I said, this is important because these are the guys who basically orchestrated one of the largest government-funded, human-based experiments in the American history. So it's important to me to know where he went to medical school. You just wonder, right? But then he goes from there. He's basically, he was an officer in the Air Force, medical services from 48 to 56. And this is where this is why they both have their own levels of importance. Sidney Gottlieb's important because he ran MK Ultra the entire time that it was in existence. Sidney Gottlieb's important because he is just always around at the right time. Like I mentioned the airmen from the Korean War earlier, right? The guys who basically were the impetus for the idea of brainwashing, because we were all like, oh, the USSR, they're brainwashing people, when it turns out we were already doing the stuff they said we weren't doing. This world is crazy. But he was, Jolyn West, Dr. Jolyn West, was one of the psychiatrists who interviewed the airmen when they came back. I think there was 4 psychiatrists on that team. He was one of them. So he was he was there on the ground floor of the idea of brainwashing in the late 40s and early 50s. And then he goes from there to MK Ultra. And what's important, even to find, I'm going to quote him right now, because like I said, it's so weird, the stuff that we do, but we found that those guys weren't brainwashed in the first place. They were not brainwashed, right? But we still were like, let's figure out how to brainwash people. And I'm going to quote Dr. West in his findings from that study. He says, what we found enabled us to rule out drugs, hypnosis, or other mysterious trickery. Meaning these guys were not brainwashed. They were just tortured into telling the truth that they didn't want to tell, that America was doing some messed up stuff. But that still didn't stop us from doing the same messed up stuff we thought that they were doing. Isn't that wild? Dr. West gets caught up with MK Ultra because he was finishing up his residency at Cornell University. MK Ultra used Cornell University as one of their hubs for study. And so he would end up working as a subcontractor for them on some of their sub-projects, a number of sub-projects, and that's how he kind of gets into it. So those were 2 of the main players that I thought were worth mentioning as far as who's doing what in this whole CIA MK Ultra plan. The last thing I'll mention before we get on to the actual operations is just LSD, right? So LSD, street name acid, was first synthesized on November the 16th, 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann at the Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. It was part of a larger research program searching for medically useful ergot alkaloid derivatives. You guys know I have no idea what that means. The abbreviation LSD is from the German lysergaridiolethylamide, right? There's a lot. Let me count the letters. Was that 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 20, 22 letters make up what turns out to be LSD. But it was a big thing at the time when it came out. Like I said, 1938 was when it was first synthesized, and not too long after that, we have receipts that were found that show the CIA bought a lot of LSD off the Swedes. The Swedes? What do you call Switzerland's when they're the Swiss? There we go. Bought a lot of LSD off the Swiss. As soon as they made it, just as fast as they could make it, they bought a bunch of it because they wanted to know, and they thought, this is the mind control drug of the future. And so that would lead to them to trying it out on so many different people. So we're going to start with Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was an operation carried out by the CIA as a sub-project of MK Ultra. It was mind control research. that began in the 1950s. It was initially established in 1954 by our good friend Sidney Gottlieb. And so the idea for Midnight Climax kind of came from the interrogation and method research that was found under Project Artichoke, as we know would turn into MK Ultra. Basically, Gottlieb would test drugs on unknowing citizens, which kind of made a legacy way for this operation for people to just continue to do it all over the place. But it consisted of them running a safe house in San Francisco at 225C Chestnut Street, San Francisco, California, and Mill Valley, California also, as well as New York City. So prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure clients back to the safe houses, where they were basically given a wide range of substances that included LSD. They were monitored behind a one-way glass. The prostitutes were told to use post-coital questioning to investigate whether the victims could be convinced to involuntarily reveal secrets, meaning that after they had done the deal, they used pillow talk to try to see just what their brain was doing. Could I possibly get you now, because you've taken this drug, to then tell me something that you wouldn't have normally told me? That was, the entire process. And it must be mentioned, this is another reason why it's, maybe the first reason is where kind of the immorality kind of comes up, is there's just a guy behind glass just watching them go at it. There's just why is he? You don't need to be there for that. Why are you? He's just watching in the name of science, right? But that was the beginning of the immoralities. The victims were sometimes fed subliminal messages in an attempt to induce them to involuntary actions, including criminal activities such as robbery, assault, and assassination. Many of the CIA operatives that were there also indulged in the drugs and prostitutes for recreational purposes, meaning they were also doing the drugs and the girls, and that had nothing to do with the study. So it's like, you're getting high on your own supply. I'm feeling a little bit of impropriety coming on. The point of this study was said to learn about the secrets of brainwashing to gain control over enemy spies and protect U.S. agents. Other objectives included finding drugs that could incapacitate the entire buildings via poisoned food, which would create confusion, anxiety, and fear. Basically, I'd heard one of the ways they did it for these safe houses is they would basically bring the women would bring the Johns into the room, and then the women would make a reason to have to leave. I need to go to the bathroom or whatever, and they would leave, and then they would kind of they would blow the LSD or whatever agent they were trying to test into the vent, so it would come through the window, or not the window, so it would come through the room, and then the guy would kind of ingest it, through his nasal passages, and the woman will come back in. And so as they're trying to see, like, can we do this in the real world, in wartime? Can we go into a building and just push this through the vents, and all of a sudden we have some sort of incapacitating agent? That was what they were trying to figure out. So that was one of the studies that they did, Operation Midnight Climax. It was very questionable, to say the least.
Well, I saw a tray with hypodermic, with a needle, a syringe, and the card on it had my name, so I looked a little more closely, and it was lysergic acid diethylamide. And my husband was a druggist, and I knew a lot of drugs, but I'd never heard of that one. And so I phoned a friend, and who was a psychiatric nurse, and I said, do you know what it is? And she said, I never heard of it. But she had a friend who was a psychiatrist, so she phoned her friend, and she called me back, and she said, he said that this stuff causes poisonous psychosis. She said he said not to take it.
And that was a woman by the name of Val Orlico. And she was a subject of one of our next studies that we're going to talk about. She was she was one of the patients in what's called the Sub-Project 68, which was funded by the Society for the Protection of Human Ecology, which we know, I don't know if I've mentioned here, but definitely that was one of the funds, one of the charities, if you will, that the CIA was funneling money into. This was the way they were able to fund all the different studies across the country. They did this. They had another one called, I think, just the Human Ecology Fund. They had a bunch of different ones. And so what they would do is they would put money into this, and then those funds would then pay the different schools or hospitals to do different studies on people. And they had no idea the entire time that it was being funded by the CIA. And so that woman that we heard, like I said, her name was Val Orlico. And that was from an interview in 1984 where she talked about her time at the Allen Institute. Now, the Allen Institute was once called Ravenscrag. It was once a mansion that was built back in the 1860s for a man named Hugh Allen. That's where we get the name of the actual property, because what would happen, I think, is he bequeathed it to some of his family once he died, and they ended up selling it to or no, excuse me, they donated it to the Royal Victoria Hospital for use as a medical facility. So it used to be a mansion for about 80 years, and then it was given to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and that's where MK Ultra comes in, is the Allen Memorial Institute. That was part of the McGill University Faculty of Medicine, and that's where they started to test a bunch of LSD on people. And she goes on to talk about, she actually ended up taking that LSD. She took it quite a few times. I think she was, by her estimation, which, I mean, I don't even know if it's probably not true, but she says she was the most tested on patient of MK Ultra. But I think she said she took LSD like 14 or 15 times. And I mean, that's a lot. It's definitely a lot. We're not going to gloss over the large amount of LSD that is, but we just don't know based off the paperwork and the history if that was the most. If because who knows? They could have been doing 30. I mean, people, we'll find out. And what they were doing here, was a little bit different than just the normal drug studies. They were doing a lot of weird stuff to people here. They were doing, like deprivation.
There was a gentleman who jumped off the roof of the Allen. I don't think he had LSD, but he had sleep therapy with psychic driving, with the driving tapes under his pillow. And they told him he was going to go home. And he'd just come out of sleep therapy. And he just jumped. He went around, big smile on his face, said goodbye to everybody, went up on the roof and jumped off and landed at the back door of the Allen, which was a dreadful, awful thing. I don't think he was more than 30. And he was just gone. Just gone.
Dr. Ewan Cameron, he was the guy who was leading the entire Allen Institute that was happening there. And he was actually one of the best psychiatrists in the world, right? He would end up being the president of the Canadian Psychiatrist Association, the American Psychiatrist, or Psychiatric Associations, and then the World Psychiatric Associations. This man was like, and that's why he was able to do kind of whatever he wanted, is everybody, and that's what I think I have a clip here. I don't know if it's going to get put in the pod, but old Val, she says, because she was getting all this exterior information from her other friends, because her husband is actually a member of parliament in Canada. So she's like not just some random person. Like she was literally the wife of, she's kind of almost the first lady, if you will. Not the first lady, but I'm saying like she was, a female spouse of a political person in politics in Canada. But so she had doctor friends who were like, don't take the LSD, like she said. And she was like, oh, well, this guy knows better than you. He's the best psychiatrist in the world. Why would he give me anything bad? Well, he definitely did. But during this documentary that I was watching, they talked about how this guy he had like one guy locked up in like a shed behind the hospital for like 35 days just to see what would happen. Like he was doing like what would happen if you left somebody like what, and that's what I mean by like that in itself is, I mean, you can call it a study, but that's torture. You know what I mean? That's torture. You can't do that to somebody, but they did it so much. A lot of people talked about that. They were for different levels, different times, for 10 days, 15 days. They did drugs. One thing they did, interestingly, we definitely have the audio from this, is there was a woman who came in, and it wasn't just her, but they were trying to hypnotize you basically by playing these crazy, like weird, like phrases while you were asleep, thinking that these would get you to wake up and be, different. They were trying to actually brainwash these people overnight. They would say things like, and we have it, I'm going to play it here in a second, but it'll be like something like, oh, you should be a better wife, or why aren't you a better husband, and you should, pick up stuff from the grocery store. And they even said they put in one thing to see if it actually worked, and obviously it didn't. But in their tapes, and I don't think I have this, but they say what do they say? You will pick up a ball of paper whenever you see it on the floor. That was like they're going to be their signal to themselves that, oh, this actually worked out. Like if they throw a ball of paper on the floor and they pick it up. Obviously they never did, because none of this stuff worked. You know what I mean? Or at least they say. But if you listened earlier, you know that I probably think that it probably did work, and they just won't tell us what actually happened. Imagine you were sleeping in the Allen Institute in the early to late 50s. This is what you would have heard.
Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why, Janine? Why?
Janine, why are you running
Why
away
are you
from
running
your
away from your
responsibilities?
responsibilities? Why are you running away? Why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away?
Oh my gosh. Imagine that. Imagine first off trying to sleep. I think it'd actually be kind of soothing. The guy was like, why? why? I'd be knocked out. And I just wake up just really inquisitive, really curious. But yeah, I mean, imagine that. So basically, they were trying to do something called psychic driving, which is basically just some sort of sleep hypnotism. They would put a tape recorder under their pillow, and that's when they would, start hearing those phrases, the why. And it was supposed to change what they thought when they woke up. But if you've ever tried to do that, then you know how ineffective that can actually be. And they did it to a bunch of people. I feel like they mostly did it to women. I'm not from what I was able to see, or like from all the people that talked about it. It was mostly women. It was mostly them trying to get them to just be better wives. I don't know why they focused in on that. But yeah, so that was some of the stuff which to me was different than what we'll see and what we have seen from the different studies. It's less, that one was specifically where overall it was less about the drugs than it was about just what can we do to people. It's kind of how they got down over at the Allen Institute. Like I said, this was run by Dr. Ewan Cameron, and they would also do some stuff. They would, like I said, they would deprive you in certain ways. They had the guy locked up in the shed out back, but they also have some footage or some. They also have some audio here from a guy they would put people to sleep, and they called it sleep therapy. And when they would put you to sleep, I guess what they would drug you enough to keep you knocked out. Then they would shock you, see if you could feel it, see what that did to you, see what changed in your vitals. It was wild.
And they kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks and playing tapes.
Yeah, this was a rough one. I feel like, I don't know why, I feel like this was one that I just thought, not that they went too far, because obviously the entire time was they went too far, but it's just, and I think what was interesting about these guys is none of them, I mean, as far as like specifically to these other Operation Midnight Climax, even what we're going to talk about with the Edgewood Arsenal, they were not, how can I put it? The Midnight Climax ones, they have no idea that they were under a study, and the Edgewood Arsenal ones, they knew they were completely under a study, right? The people at the Allen Institute went there to get well. And that, to me, makes it more sinister. They went there, some of these women only went there because they were suffering from postpartum depression. Literally. That was what they were checked in for. It wasn't quite called that back then because people didn't really think of it like that, but that's what it was. And because of that, they would be tortured, mentally. In basically just because they were around, because they existed and were breathing. That, to me, if you look at from all the ones that we're going to talk about, I think this is probably the saddest one in my opinion. And that's because some of these people were only there for a few weeks, and it changed their lives forever. Some of them were there for a few months, but nobody was there for like ever. I mean, some of them would end up being institutionalized in other places afterwards, but most of it was relatively short, in the time that they spent there. And I have another piece here from a woman who it's I don't know, it's when you hear what she says, I couldn't imagine being put in that position.
I was home for the weekend, and I had a pass for the weekend. That's how they call it. So when I was there, I said, I'm not going back there. So I telephoned, or somebody else in the house telephoned, and they said, if you're not coming back, we're sending the police after you. So I remember being so upset. I was crying. I didn't want to go in. And it was really like a concentration camp.
And this was one of the women, I do believe, that was sent there just for postpartum depression. But I don't know. It makes it even weirder. Like I said, when they were able to go home, and you want to drag them back to this torture dungeon, this hospital that's supposed to be for good, that you're using for evil, essentially. In my opinion, it's really messed up. And we're gonna, the more we talk about this stuff, the more you will probably see. I mean, I don't know how you can morally do any of this stuff. There's definitely, I don't know. This is definitely immoral, to say the least. But that'll bring us to the Edgewood Arsenal, which sounds like a really cool soccer team, but it's actually just a hospital in Maryland, not too far, about northeast of Baltimore. And so a lot of this was done. A lot of this was the stuff that was done at Edgewood was done by a man named Dr. Ketchum. but he was also working with the Army Chemical Corps, which would end up being a large part of what would, I think, really be, I think, at least 20 to 30%, in my opinion, of the CIA's kind of makeup at that time, because you have to imagine parts of the CIA came from the Army, and the Army Chemical Corps is also doing the same stuff. So it's like they're working hand in hand. But most of this work was done by the Army Chemical Corps. All of these studies were done on U.S. Army soldiers who did actually volunteer specifically for these tasks, but the tasks were unknown. They didn't know what they were signing up for. And if you listen to some of the interviews, these guys were just happy to have less work to do. Because what I guess one of the stipulations that came, but for signing up, was that you had light duty and you could go home on the weekends and all this stuff. So they made it really sweet, made it kind of a sweet deal for them. But in return, they were doing all sorts of crazy stuff to their bodies. So from 1948 to 1975, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps conducted classified human subject research at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland. The purpose was to evaluate the impact of low-dose chemical warfare agents on the military personnel and to test protective clothing, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines. A small portion of these studies were directed at psychochemical warfare and grouped under the prosaic title of the Medical Research Volunteer Program. That lasted from 56 to 75, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, where the guys came in and they tested on them. They're right when they say it wasn't all just drugs. It wasn't all just like psychedelic drugs. They tried out a bunch of different stuff on these guys. They tried out this thing called BZ, which I think to date is what they say was one of the most successful things they probably brought out of, if you could put, successful in air quotes, one of the more successful things that was able to come from all of these tests. And it was some sort of nerve agent that would basically incapacitate the subject to the point where they were so kind of, in pain, if you will, but not, so you could do whatever you want with them. But I'm not sure why. It was really violent. You should go on, because I don't think I have any of the actual, because there's no point. Most of it's inaudible because they're like gasping and gagging and spitting and stuff. It's not worth putting on here, but they put them through the ringer. But I definitely do have a couple audio bits for this. But basically, over 7,000 soldiers took part in these experiments. They involved exposures to more than 250 different chemicals. This is according to the DoD. They were stopped in 75, as we said. This really came amidst an atmosphere of scandal and recrimination as lawmakers accused the researchers of questionable tactics and ethics, and because they would find out. We'll talk about it a little bit later. We'll find out. We only know about this stuff really from the Rockefeller Commission, which came out in 1975, I do believe. I could be wrong. I think it was 75. It could be 73. But that's where we find out about MK Ultra. That's where we find out that the CIA has been randomly drugging people all across the nation and the world. So this is really when the world finds out all the messed up stuff that the Army and the CIA has been doing. But the different stuff they tested on them at Edgewood, let's see, they had sarin gas, mustard agents, nerve agent antidotes, bunch of stuff. Like I'm not a scientist. Like they did LSD, they did PCP, cannabinoids, BZ, alcohol and caffeine. They did all that stuff to them.
How do you feel? I feel pretty good, sir.
Do you? Are you cold?
No, I'm not cold at all.
Are you tired?
No, I'm not tired. Well, I could run.
Could do some more, could you?
Yes, sir. I could run. I run 100 miles right now.
Is that right? You
That's
feel
right.
Pretty pepped up, huh?
Uh-huh. I run through it, and now I feel good, and I'm not tired, and I can run through it again.
This soldier was on PCP while he was running an obstacle course. They basically put him through an obstacle course while he was on PCP, and then when he was done, they stopped him and asked him some questions. And as you can tell, he's definitely acting like a man that's on PCP.
Did Sergeant Ditchkus give you any instructions about what you were supposed to do tomorrow?
Sergeant Ditchkus? Yes. Let me see. What was I supposed to do tomorrow? Tomorrow? What, is today Thursday?
Today's Thursday, that's right.
Today's Thursday. Uh-huh. Well, tomorrow...
Like I said, they really put that man through the ringer. And like a lot of these people would not be checked up on throughout history, or throughout the rest of their lives. Most of them would never get any sort of follow-up care or treatment. They were kind of just sent out into the world after having had these crazy things done to them. I mean, imagine if you join the military and you end up doing LSD 10 times, and now you have to go out into the world and be regular, and no one knows that you did LSD 10 times. They're just like, that military vet, he's really weird, you know? I mean, there's a guy, I mean, you can see what I would recommend this movie, which I don't think I put in the beginning, but it's called Operation Delirium. Dr. Delirium. Let me get it right. Yeah, Dr. Delirium and the Edgewood Experiments. This is a lot of the footage. Some of the footage that you're hearing, the audio footage, is from. It's not from that documentary specifically, but they also have the same video. They don't usually play a lot of the raw audio with it, but it's the same stuff, and you can see they have guys there that are just off their rocker. There's one interesting fellow that they focus on throughout the movie, and I have the raw audio, and the video will actually be on the works cited for the website. The man's name is Ronald Zadrozny, and he's interesting because basically they gave him what I would amount to, I think, was it LSD? I think it was LSD.
For the actual test, Private Zadrozny received a high dose of the incapacitating agent, given intramuscularly to permit precise measurement of dosage. In 15 minutes, he won't be able to focus his eyes properly. In an hour, his speech will become difficult.
But whatever they gave him, he was awake. He was on it for like 3 days, and so basically he was never able to get right. Now he was able to get married. Man was married multiple times, at least 3 times, but the third one would prove to be a doozy. Old Ronald would commit a murder-suicide with he and his wife in 1995. The question is, was his behavior attributed to the chemicals that were pumped into his brain in the 70s by the Army, or was Ronald always just not okay?
For Zadrozny, the high-dose subject, the peak of mental incapacitation arrived about 9 hours after exposure to the agent. He remained awake, experiencing hallucinations for a total of 36 hours. The severe disturbance in his mental processes overlapped the peak of physical incapacitation.
I mean, you be the judge. Who knows? Go on there, and I'm saying this because you can go on there. The man's name is Ronald Zadrozny. And if you watch the documentary, or if you go on the works site, you'll see it. Because I guess I've been told I should prep people before they actually watch this documentary. It's not a good documentary. Well, meaning like the people who did it, they could have done light years better than what they did. But the footage they have is top notch. The way they presented it, to be desired. But so I have some of the raw footage. If you want to skip all that, window dressing, and jump straight to it, you'll see him. He's kind of like the brunette gentleman. He's a fairly attractive individual. He's doing kind of weird eyebrow things in the camera. You see, if you ever look up the Edgewood experiments, his face is usually what comes up. That man killed himself and his wife in the mid-90s. And you just have, like I said, you have to wonder, was it the chemicals, or was Zadrozny always going to be Zadrozny? And I think, yeah, since we're mentioning it, I have his stuff here. You can hear Mr. Zadrozny 20 years before he would kill himself and his wife.
Zadrozny, when do you think you would have been able to resume normal function?
I think at about 2 in the morning, 2 o'clock Monday morning.
About 2.5 days.
Yes. That's when I felt I knew what was happening before that when I got up for the hot meal we had. But I didn't feel coordinated enough or something like that to take part in any action. So I went back to sleep, and then when I got up about 2, I felt I could do things.
I mean, you got to feel compassion for these guys. I know I do. I can't imagine. I mean, these guys sign up to serve their country, right? And then they're thinking like anybody else. Oh, I can sign up for this program. Where they just test some stuff on us. The government wouldn't do us wrong. They wouldn't do anything crazy to us. They wouldn't, alter our minds forever. They definitely wouldn't do that, right? And we get light duty and we get weekends off. Like, yeah, it's a no-brainer. We go up to old Edgewood. No. Like I said, it cannot be overstated. This man would murder himself and his wife about 20 to 25 years after this. It's just what you want to put a face to a name for some of this stuff. And like I said, go check out the Works Cited. You can see these people. You know, you look at if you go look at Val Orlico from the Allen Institute. That's a woman that you look at her and you're like, oh, this woman definitely did 10 tabs of acid. Like, and you feel for her. It's like she's just holding on to the side of the earth right now. That's all she can do. The woman has a buzz cut and she's got like eyeshadow on, like pink eyeshadow. It's wild. It is. You just look at her and you want to hug her. Like, I'm sorry, Val. I'm sorry that happened to you. But this was just indicative of what was happening all across the world. And I think probably the worst yet, in America. In America's backyard. San Francisco, right? New York, Montreal, Stanford, all across the country. Cornell, University of Oklahoma. All these places were taking money from these funds that were being secretly funded by the CIA in their MKUltra experiment. That's why it can get a little muddy when we talk about all these things, but it must be connected, and it can't be overlooked that all of these were serving the same quote-unquote greater good. All of these were going back to Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was overseeing this entire process. And it's not to say that he's the scapegoat. I'm just saying, you know, it's at 15 to 20 to 30 to 40 different places, but the focus is all the same. The focus is all trying to understand people's brains, to change them, to incapacitate them in some capacity, to control them. That was the point. And the way they went about it, man, like I said, it's just you got to feel for these people. You got to feel for these people. We're going to talk about a few more. There have been a couple. We talked about Ronald Zadrozny and his murder suicide, but there have been a couple other deaths that can be almost they can be attributed to the MKUltra, this overzealousness to test people with drugs that we don't know what will happen to them. We don't know the outcome, but let's shoot them up with it anyways. They were doing a lot of that back then. So one guy we're going to talk about. Well, let me see. Before we get to, let me make sure we're still on track, still moving along. So we talked about Edgewood. I'll tell you what. All right, we're gonna hold off. But there's two deaths. There's two deaths we're gonna talk about. I don't mean to like dangle it in front of you, but there's two guys that died during this time. But we're gonna talk about, before we get to that, one more project. I think before we get to the idea of actually how did America find out about MKUltra. And the reason I want to cover this is because this is just, once again, just the brazenness, just the audacity, the gall, right, that the CIA had to do some of the stuff they were doing. They ended up testing some of these. Let's see, they tested anthrax in Washington, D.C. They tested it on a Greyhound bus terminal at the National Airport. I mean, these are just people. And this is just the government. It's remarkable that they just thought that this was okay. So this was called Project 112. I want to get ahead of ourselves here. This is May 1965. All right. And this in itself, I believe, is also a part of the MKUltra. Like, that's why you find these projects. They're project, sub-project. They're called that because they're just below the actual larger objective. And this was categorically denied by the military until about 20 years ago, until CBS did an evening news investigative report that brought out all the salacious goodies. The report caused the DOD and the Department of Veterans Affairs to launch an extensive investigation of the experiments and to reveal the affected personnel and expose the people that had been exposed. But yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there because it's, you think it ends, it never ends. You can find a million different studies in which the CIA was just doing stuff to people unwittingly, and they just thought it was okay for like a long time. So let's bring about how we found out about MKUltra. So in 1973, amid a government-wide panic caused by Watergate, which we covered, I believe, in episode 73, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files to be destroyed. Pursuant to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. If only that were true. A cache of some 20,000 documents survived the purge, as they had been incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were discovered following a FOIA request in 1977. So let's just stop for a second and talk about what that is. So in 1973, right, after Watergate happens, after the White House plumbers go into the Watergate Hotel looking for some stuff, digging some stuff up, and then everyone realizes just how corrupt the government actually is, the CIA decides, hey, you know what, we should, we've been drugging and killing a lot of people here recently, in the last 20 to 25 years, and it seems like now people are starting to care. Maybe we should shred some docies, right? A little snip to the documents, if you feel me. So they tried to shred as much as they could, but, and what we'll find, and you can see, I have the actual, some of the documents that they found. It'll be on the works site at httapn.com. Go check it out. They literally are paying, like it's an itemized bill for all the debauchery that they're doing. You know, $60,000 for this, acid for that, you know, pay this doctor for that. And that's what we found. Because, like I said, back then, I don't think people ever thought this was going to be a thing. I don't think people ever thought they were going to have like accountability to the American public for the vicious things that they did. So these documents were stored where they probably should have been stored, with the financial records of like all of the CIA stuff, not with the nefarious, top secret, don't want to tell the government stuff. No, they just stashed with all the rest of the stuff about money. And so when they shred all this stuff, they forget about the money trail. Like I say, always follow the money. So that's what we found. That's how we know. That's how we know now that the MKUltra studies existed. We don't have the actual studies. All we have is these bits and pieces from these other kind of offshoots, these tangential studies that were done under the same umbrella, but we don't have the actual documentation where they were writing out all the different stuff that had to do with it, because they shredded it 40 years ago, 50 years ago, excuse me. So yeah, I just wanted to lay that down in case you got lost in what I was saying. Let's get back to kind of reading the timeline here. So in December 1974, the New York Times alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on U.S. citizens during the 60s, which we have just talked about that extensively. That report prompted investigations by the United States Congress in the form of the Church Committee and by a commission known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into the illegal domestic activities of the CIA, FBI, and other intelligence-related agencies and the military. The CIA tried to stop this, but it went through. And when this came out, like I said, I don't have the audio from that. I might try to find it, but you'll find that they talk about, just in 75, they're like, hey, these guys were doing, they were drugging people. I guess what I'm saying is what I'm telling you right now is not news. It's not news. It's not. It's barely even a hot topic. It's just something that I think has been brought out and then washed away with the rest of the whatever's happening in the news cycle. It's they found out in 75 that they were doing this stuff, and people were mad then. But you go through generations and people kind of forget. I guess that's why we're doing this here. But so yeah, the Rockefeller Commission is how we know about people like Dr. Frank Olson. He's one of the deaths that I'm going to talk to you about today. Dr. Frank Olson, he was a scientist who worked for the CIA and for the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. He allegedly committed suicide in 1953 by jumping out of a window in his hotel room in New York City. But we would find out that would also not be the case. This occurred after Olson drank a cocktail that had been secretly spiked with LSD while on a CIA retreat. His family never believed the suicide idea, and there's a great show/documentary if you want to check it out that will go into this much more deeper than I ever could. It's called Wormwood. It's on Netflix. Check it out. But the second autopsy revealed injuries that occurred before he fell. Basically, he got beat up and kind of thrown out of a window. This guy, he was one of the only people on MKUltra with a conscience. And rest in peace, Frank Olson. That's kind of thing why what happened. He basically kind of came to his senses, if I understand kind of what happened. He had been around for a while, was seeing the stuff that I just kind of told you about, all the drugging, the locking in cages, the deprivation, the LSD, the PCP, all this good stuff. He saw that he was like, hey, maybe we don't do this as much anymore. They're like, hey, why don't you come out with us for a vacation, pal? Have this drink here. Oh, you're on LSD now. Whoa, you're on drugs. Oh, you just fell out of a window. Oh, he's gone. Frank Olson is dead. This is in 1953. And they tell his family, and you can find it on the documentary, that he, quote, I think they say he was fell and or pushed and had an accident, or he had an accident and was fell or pushed out of a window. And they said his son was just sitting there trying to figure out for like the rest of his life how that could even be possible. How you could have an accident, fall, and be pushed or something like that out of a window, because it was never the case. The man was basically, I think, beaten and then thrown out of a window. That's Dr. Frank Olson. That's, I think you have to put the body bags, you know, where they belong, and you can't just, this isn't all just anecdotal, you know, hooked on, get these guys on drugs. Look how crazy they're acting. They were killing people, you know, and these are only the bodies that we know about. These are only the people that they'll tell us about. You have to imagine. It has to go much deeper. And so we got one more death I think we want to cover. And I say the death just because, like I said, a lot of this just gets talked about with people who, I mean, obviously had major mental issues and went through large changes in their life from, you know, dealing with this stuff. But there were some people who just never went home. You know, even these people did get to go home a little bit different, they got to go home. There's a man named Harold Blower, who was another one who died as a product of the MK Ultra stuff. He was a tennis pro in the state of New York, right, in 1953. Now, it's interesting to know, I think both of these guys also, they died in 1953. They both died in the state of New York in separate incidents.
In 1975, I was living in California with my 2 children, and there was a knock on the door, and 2 people in uniform were at the door. They said they were from the Pentagon, and they wanted to talk to me about the death of my father. And I told them that my father had been dead a long time. They came in and they told me that they had found papers at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. And these papers had information about my father's death.
But Blower checked into the New York State Psychiatric Institute, which still exists now, in late 1952, seeking help for depression following a divorce. So like I said, that's what makes some of this stuff so sad. I mean, you could argue the immorality of all this, but some of it is just to a level that is hard to comprehend. Is these people are seeking, they're seeking out help, and this is what the government gives back to them. So he's checked into the NYSPI in late 1952 because he's depressed because my man just got divorced. While at the facility, he was used as a test subject in experiments conducted by the Army Chemical Corps. Maybe we talked about that a little bit earlier. The Army had a classified agreement with the Psychiatric Institute that allowed them to study possible chemical warfare compounds by administering these substances to patients. Between November 1952 and January 1953, Blower was given injections of various chemical analogs of mescaline. He was first given low doses of MDA, then DMA, then DMA again. He requested to withdraw from these treatments because evidently he knew he was being used kind of experimentally, but I think he didn't think they would go as far as they did.
On January 8th, 1953, between 9:53 and 9:57 a.m., my father was injected with 450 milligrams, or 6.47 milligrams kilograms of body weight of EA1298. According to the drug study notes, at 9:57, my father became very restless and had to be restrained by the nurse. He began sweating profusely and flailing his arms wildly. At 10:01, he pulled up in bed, his body stiffened, his teeth clenched, and he began frothing at the mouth. Similar reactions continued for over an hour. My father was still talking and moving his legs randomly at 11:05. Finally, at about 1.5 hours after the injection had begun, my father lapsed into a coma. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 p.m.
NYSPI claimed the overdose was accidental since the safe doses for these mescaline analogs were based only on a guess. From some documentaries that I've listened to and watched, they had no idea what they were giving this guy. No idea. I mean, I could use the words from the documentary. I mean, you'll probably see it. It's on the work site. It's just, they had no idea what they were giving this guy. And of course, once he died, they covered up his death for 22 years until 1987, when a United States District Court judge awarded Blower's estate $700,000 in a ruling that described Blower as a guinea pig, whose medical records had been altered to disguise the actual cause of death. Like I said, they had no idea what they were doing to this man. And the same thing kind of happened with Frank Olson. They denied it, till right around the same time, and they ended up paying him out just about the same amount of money. It's really sad when you sit down and look at it. And the last thing that I'll cover here before we go ahead and get out of here, it's been a long one. is the Family Jewels. It is the name of a set of reports detailing illegal, inappropriate, and otherwise sensitive activities conducted by the CIA from 1959 to 1973. It's basically all of the skeletons in their closet, all of the bodies. So it's a long list. I'm not going to list it off to you, all of it to you, but there are some interesting ones here. Let's go through it just for a little bit. So number one, the confinement of a KGB defector, Yuri Nosenko. He might be regarded as a violation of the kidnapping laws, is what they said, quote unquote. Let's see, they wiretapped some syndicated columnists in America, physical surveillance of investigative journalist Jack Anderson. They broke into a few homes. One of a former CIA employee. They opened the mail from pretty much anybody from to and from the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1973. So if you mailed a letter from America to Russia from 53 to 73, the government read it. Just that's interesting. They mentioned MK Ultra in here. Like this was some, I guess this was really them. I guess once they got caught, they were like, all right, well, we'll put it all on the table, you know. But I mean, like I said earlier, they're not going to tell us where all the bodies are buried. They're not going to do it. Let's see, testing of electronic equipment on U.S. telephone circuits. That is so vague. That is so vague. But yeah, so that was this was I think it's been an interesting episode. The CIA is as we see multifaceted, and just there's so many different arms to it. And they did some really messed up stuff. They did some really messed up stuff. Like I don't know how, you know, you'll walk away from this feeling. But the idea, I mean, imagine being the guy in the shack out back of the Allen Institute. Imagine being that guy. Like, or anybody that knew that guy and was like, where, I mean, we'll call him Shack Guy, but like, you know, I don't know, like David. Hey, where, you seen David? No, I think he went to a hospital. He was sick. You think, oh, David's in there just getting well. David's in a shack out back, bro. David's shacked up in the back, like for like a month. It's wild. Like, and this is what makes it the wildest part, I think, which I don't know, we talked about it, but I don't know if we talked about it. And all of this was funded by government tax dollars. That's what is, you know, when you think about it, I mean, I think that's why they had so many receipts. That's why really think that's why they ended up getting caught, because when you're using tax dollars, you know, for the government, you have to basically still, even though you're doing all this nefarious, this crazy stuff, you have to account for it. You know what I mean? You have to bring back your receipts when you're on travel. And that's where the smoking gun was. Like I said before about following the money, it was in the fact that all of the receipts from all the drugs they bought and all that stuff. Yeah, it's, man, but yeah. So that's been the CIA and all their human, government funded human based experiments. All right, so that was the CIA and all of their human-based experiments that were funded by the government. I mean, what a ride that was. I learned so much. I mean, literally so much. I would say there's probably even more stuff that we'll talk about on the mini episode next week that I didn't even get to, that will just, you know, it was just, my brain was saturated by the time that I finished all of the information that I took in for this, but in a good way. I loved it, and we'll definitely be applying the same amount of energy for whatever comes next for our next episode. But yeah, I mean, the CIA, it's what I find interesting. Literally, I think one of the most interesting things to me is the way they did it, the way they did the funds, like how they did the Human Ecology Fund. Like it's really smart. It's, you know, well, let's make a nonprofit, let's fund a nonprofit, and then have that nonprofit conduct studies. Boom, can't track it back to us. Where's the money come from? I don't know. It's cash. You know, like, it's really interesting. But yeah, so check out that works cited. I think there's some good stuff. Check out about Ronald Zadrozny. I mean, if you can find some more information about this guy, I looked a lot. I tried to find, I mean, I couldn't find enough information about this guy. I mean, he's the poster child for why you don't do studies like this on people. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, HTT Happen for all of that. At HTT Happen For the socials, httabin.com was the website. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Give us 5 stars wherever you're finding this. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, give us 2 stars. Tell us why you didn't like it, because constructive criticism is always welcome. Thank you guys for coming back week to week and press and play. I really do appreciate it. And I'm going to play you out with a little bit more of Val Orlico, our friend Val, the buzz cut with the pink eyeshadow.
Say, I can't take it anymore. I can't stand it. I don't think this is doing me any good. I feel worse. And he'd walk down the hall a little way with me and put his arm on my shoulder. And come on now, Lassie, you know you're going to do it. And finally I'd say, well, okay. And off we'd go to my room, and he would give me another injection and then pat me on the shoulder, and off he'd be again.